Hello, and welcome to today's video of Lost Without Excel, where it is my goal to help you complete accounting tasks in Excel. In today's video, I'll be covering two month-end tasks, the PTO or vacation accrual and the payroll accrual. The reason that these are in one video instead of two is because they have generally the same timing when a accounting period is being closed, and they're usually based on the same underlying reports. The benefits of the final product of this video will be that if you're doing this for a single company, then as you need to update your data on a month-to-month basis, once this is set up, it should take you just a few minutes to get your calculation for both your PTO accrual and your wage and tax accrual. If you are doing this for multiple companies, the same applies. We're going to have one template that we can drop the data for different companies into. And then since we already have our template, it should take a very short time to get the information for the new company. And for the wage and taxes calculation, if we need to change the inputs or any of the variables, it's much easier to do it this way rather than creating a new template or calculate something by hand each month. I'll come back to these towards the end of the video once we have the template to walk through this. So our starting point is going to be the raw data that we're going to get from usually the payroll or HR departments, or if it's one department, it might be two different systems. We're going to take that data and compile it into one worksheet. We might have to modify it a bit. Then I'll do the accrued PTO calculation with an associated pivot table so that we can do a journal entry. I'll then cover how we're going to do our wage and taxes calculation, update that pivot table, because again, our goal here is to have something to put into a journal entry. I'll talk about how we're going to distribute this information without including the raw employee data. And then briefly, I'll cover some error checking, but that's not the main focus of this video. So for our raw data, I'm going to assume that we are unable to get one report out of either our HR or payroll system that covers everything that we need. I'm going to use a real world example of we actually need to go to three sources. The first source is going to be what I usually call a current employee list. This generally comes out of the HR system, and it's just going to list who at the end of the month was employed. We're going to use this as our master file or master report. What I mean by that is if there's an employee on one of the other two reports that we'll get to that's not on this master list, I'm going to ignore them because we need to start with something as kind of our population of who we're calculating this for. This report and the others might have a lot more information than what I'm showing on the screen, but what I wanted to focus on is the important pieces of information. There may be another 40 columns on the actual report you get, and we can just ignore those. The important pieces that we need, though, are some sort of unique identifier out of the HR system. I've worked in a company before that actually had to have two unique identifiers because we had one in our HR system and one in our payroll system. So I'm going to walk through how that would work. And then any information about if we're working with multiple companies, which company they're employed in, and then if we're going to be doing our journal with departments or locations, or basically however we intend to split up this data at the journal entry stage, we need the information on one of these reports. The second source generally comes out of the payroll system, and that's just going to be a list of the employee, their ID, and the number of hours they have accrued at the end of the month. And the third source is, depending on how your company works, it's either out of the HR or payroll system, and it's going to be a list of all the employees and their current pay rate. So with these three, and with what we'll get to in a few minutes, with a few assumptions that we need to make, we can get to both a PTO and a payroll accrual. So the first thing that I'm going to do is, since my goal here with our template is on a month-to-month basis, we're going to update source 1, 2, and 3 with new information. So what I want to do is to have a completely separate worksheet and combine all of that data onto here with our calculations so that we don't risk overwriting the information when we're updating, overwriting the formulas when we're updating the information. So first thing I'm going to do is I need to get the information from this source, the master source, into our combined data worksheet. So on the data ribbon, I'm going to click filter, and I'm just going to work with the employees for company 2 as a starting point. So I'm going to copy all those and paste them into our new worksheet. And for this first calculation of the PTO accrual, I need to get two pieces of information. I need to know their PTO hours from the payroll system, and I need to know their hourly rate. And when you're working with a worksheet where you have essentially raw data and then either modified data or formulas, I recommend always either giving your headers a color, or if you prefer, the entire column. What this is going to do is when you come back next month, it will stand out, at least on this worksheet, that here's the data that I can paste over, but I shouldn't touch anything over here because these are all formulas. So to pull in our PTO hours, we're going to do an X lookup. So the way an X lookup works is formulas X lookup. The first thing we're looking for is a lookup value. The second piece of information we need for this is where we're going to search for that value. So there's going to be a lookup range. And then once we find that value in the range, we need to tell Excel what we want to return back as our answer. There are other components to that formula that we don't need today, so I'm not going to cover them. But the X lookup does work with just those three pieces. So what this means is I want to bring back this PTO balance column. So what we're going to do is we're going to write an X lookup to say that we want to find these payroll IDs in this column on this worksheet, and whenever the formula finds that, I want to return the balance in column C for that same row. So what that will look like is we're going to search for the payroll ID in the column of the source report that has the ID, and we want to return the column from the source report that has the balance. Now, there's a couple of ways to get the formula down into all the rows. We can copy it and paste it here. We can grab the when your mouse hovers over the bottom right corner of a cell, there'll be a little square that appears, and if you hover over that, your cursor will turn into a plus sign, and then you can drag that down. Or we can just double click on that bottom right corner and the formula will fill out all the way. So we have our PTO hours. Now we need to do an XLOOKUP to go find the employee's hourly rate. But we're going to run into an issue here because some of our employees are listed in a salary format and some of our employees are listed in an hourly format. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to add a formula here that's going to give us our hourly rate. And the way that I'm going to do this is with an if statement or an if function. So an if function is going to be, an if function is essentially a yes/no question, and then based on if the answer to our question is yes or no, we will return two different values. So the first part of the formula is going to be your criteria or your test. It's basically your yes/no question. Then you want to say if the answer to that was yes, or if it was true, we're going to return a certain value. And then if the answer to that criteria or test was false, or if the answer was no, then we're going to have a value if it is false. So the criteria that I'm going to apply is I'm going to say if a pay rate is over $10,000, then it's not hourly, because anyone beneath that should be hourly, and if you have an annual rate, I'm assuming it's far above 10,000. You can pick whichever number works for you, but I'm going to use 10,000 as my example. So the format for that is we're going to say, and let me move this so you can see it as I type. So if the pay rate is greater than 10,000, so that being my true, false, or yes, no question. So if the pay rate is over 10,000, then what I want to do is I want to take that pay rate and divide it by 2,080. That number comes from there are 52 weeks in a year and 40 working hours in a week. So 40 times 52 is 2,080. So that's going to convert an annual rate into an hourly rate. And then if this test is false, so if the hourly rate is not greater than 10,000, then that means it's already in an hourly format, and so I just need to know that what that hourly answer is. So in this case, 130,000 is more than 10, so it divides it into an hourly rate for me. I recommend also always using the relevant formats on your numbers, whether that's a $sign or another currency, hours, time, whatever. It's good practice to add formats to your worksheets. So I'm going to use that same trick to double click and just move this down to the bottom. So now it's going down to all of our employees. And as you can see, when we get to an hourly amount, it doesn't divide it. It just brings over whatever that hourly amount already was. So back to our combined data. Now I'm going to do the XLOOKUP again. And in this case, I'm going to look up that same payroll ID on our third source. And when that's found, I want to return our calculated column. Same thing here. I'm going to add a format and then double click. So now that we have our hours and our hourly rate, we can get our PTO accrual by employee, which is just going to be, and you can use plus or equals to start your formula. They both work the same. Our hours times our rate is our accrual. Now, one other thing that I'm going to do here before I move on is, in this case, it's a round number, but I'm going to get to a point here where we're going to have way too many decimals. And this can easily cause an issue with your accounting systems, because most of the ones that I've worked in, or at least all of them, I believe, require just 2 decimals because we don't want to be doing journals with partial cents. So the way that we're going to fix this is with the round function. So a round function only has two parts. Essentially, it's whatever number that you're trying to round and then the number of digits that you're rounding it to. So in this case, I'm just going to add it in here to the same formula. We're going to do a round of that calculation, and I only want it to be to 2 digits. Now when I copy this down, I can add a few decimals. Now everything is going to be cut off to 2 decimals. And we'll copy it all the way down. So now we have our PTO accrual. But this still isn't in a very pretty format to use for a journal entry. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to highlight our entire data range and use that to create a pivot table. So just in case your data range is much larger than what I'm working with and you don't want to be holding down your mouse to get to all of your data, if you click in the upper left corner of your data, including the headers, and hold down Control, Shift, and then either right, down, or down and then right, as long as there's no breaks or like empty columns or rows, you'll get your full data. Oh, and I don't want to copy that. I want to go to my Insert menu and click on Pivot Table. In this case, it's just confirming that our range is what I selected and whether I want to create a new worksheet for our table or have it somewhere in the same page. I almost always go with a new worksheet, and so I'm not going to change anything here. So for our pivot table, what we eventually want to add up is that PTO accrual that we calculated. And at the beginning, I mentioned that we might be doing this for more than one company or different departments or locations. However you want to be splitting this up, we need to add each of those as additional rows so that the calculation gets split out. And another tip, I would always title your worksheets, even if it's just something as simple as pivot. It'll save you a lot of time if you're coming back later and you forget exactly where the kind of end answer is, or you can call this the summary or the journal, whatever it is, as long as people know to go, whoever's going to be using this, to go to this worksheet to get their final answer. And similar to in our data, where I wanted to have the right formats, in the pivot table, I want to have the right format. So you can highlight the pivot table and add the format the same way, but it didn't happen this time. But sometimes when you change an aspect of the pivot table, like removing rows, sometimes that formatting can go away. So what I would recommend is over here to click on the data we're adding up and go to the value field settings and then number format and just confirm that it's in an accounting format. All right, so if all we needed to do today was our PTO accrual, then we can use this information either whether you're doing it by department, whether you need to do it by locations, whether you need to split that the other way and have the location total and then split. This will get you to where you need to be. I'm not going to cover how you would add this to an upload template because that's going to look different for every software, whether it's an Excel upload template, whether you have like a saved transaction, whether you can cut and paste into your software. But at the very least, even if you have to manually code this in, we're way ahead of where we started. So the next step here is we also want to do our wage and tax accrual. So where we're going to start with that is on our back on our combined data worksheet, we need to add a few more columns. We need a wage accrual and we need a tax accrual. So, but to get to those first, we need to create an accrual counter because we need to know how many days to accrue. So the important thing here is that the important date is not the last pay date, but the last time employees were paid through. So, for example, if we do, or if our last payroll of the month is the 30th, but on the 30th we were only paid through the 23rd, then the 23rd is the important piece of information. So, as part of your template, I would recommend setting up a payroll accrual calendar. Usually the payroll department has a calendar of all the pay dates, but I'm going to just create a very quick one here where we're just going to list our pay date, essentially, and then when we're paid through. So this is going to be different for every company, but let's say you're in the US and you are paid every other Friday, the 13th being one of the Fridays in January. What we can do is just say the next pay date is going to be 14 days later than that. Excuse me, plus 14. So the next one will be the 27th, and then if we drag this down, we can get all the way to the end of the year, and the 29th of December will be our last one of the year. But every Friday, we're paid through, let's say, the prior Friday. So every time we're paid, we're actually only paid through 7 days prior. So what that means is, in the case of, let's take the end of January, and January of 2023 has 31 days, as January always does, but the number of weekdays from the 27th is only 2, the 30th and the 31st. But because what we care about is we want to be paid through, we were only paid through the 20th, there's actually 7 working days that we weren't paid for. So what I would do at the beginning of each year is to set up a calendar that looks something like this, which is what is the last payroll of the month, when were we paid through, and then how many days do we need to accrue for based on the last paid through date. I don't have any fancy formulas to show you here. This one, it's a once a year activity and it only takes a few minutes, so I would just do it by hand. But the important thing here is if we've set it up once at the beginning of the year, we don't have to go every month and figure out how many days we need to do, because we've already done it at the beginning. And again, if we're applying this across multiple companies, or if different people are going to be processing each month, we don't need to rely on each person calculating the same thing. So now that we have our calendar, I'm going to come back to our data, and we still need we still need one more piece of information for our wage accrual. Since this number of days to accrue each month is different, and I don't want to update the formula each month, I basically want to refer to a different cell that we're going to update. So generally the way that I set up my workbooks is if there are some independent inputs like the number of days or like a percentage or something else, I usually add a reference or a variable worksheet. And in this case, our first one is going to be the number of days to accrue. And I'm going to manually update this and just say every month, in addition to dropping in our source data, we need to go here and just confirm that if we're doing January, then we need 7, same in February, but then when we get to March, whoever's doing this would come in and change it to 10. Where that's going to help is for our wage accrual, our calculation is going to be, we're going to take everyone's hourly rate times 8 hours a day times this cell on the reference worksheet. And so for this person, that's 3,500. Now, if I were to copy this down, it starts to error out very quickly. The reason for that is when I drag that formula down, this B1 reference here will become a B2 and then a B3 and so on, but I want that to always refer to just this cell. So the way that I fix that is with absolute referencing. So there's a couple ways you can do it. You can type in $signs around the B and the 1, or if you want a hotkey, you can click F4 on your keyboard and it'll cycle through the difference, whether you want to freeze neither value, just or both, just the column, just the row, or sorry, just the row, just the column, or nothing. In our case, we want to freeze both of them. And now when I drag it down, we're still referencing B1 instead of referencing, let's say, B31 or B30. So we have our wage accrual. Now we need our tax accrual. The only thing we need to know for our tax accrual is our estimated employer payroll tax rate. So that's going to be a second input here. And if you want to figure this out at your company, you can look at a payroll summary report. You can look at the last 6 to 12 months of your at your income statement, just kind of see how they break out. I've almost always used 8% where I've lived in the US, but if you need this number to be 10 or 12 or 20, I would just include it here as a payroll tax rate input. And then all we're going to do here is we're going to say that we want our tax accrual to be the wages times whatever percentage we picked. I'm going to start off with the absolute referencing. The benefit of doing it this way is if you come back later and you decide that actually 9% is better, or 12%, or whatever you want to put in as that value, you don't have to redo any of the formulas here because everything is just going to this cell. So you change the one cell and it'll change the formulas that we're doing here. And I also realized that I forgot to do this round function around the wage accrual. So I'm going to quickly come back to that. We're just going to do a round of the same formula to 2 digits and copy it down. Same thing with the tax accrual. I want to do a round of that formula to 2 digits. Okay, then rather than creating an entirely new pivot table, I would like to just add it to my existing pivot table. So what I'm going to do is in this pivot table analyze ribbon, I'm going to change the data source. And there's a couple ways you can do this, but I'm just going to start up in the upper left, do the same, Control Shift right and down. And now we've grabbed the 2 extra columns, or 2 extra columns of that data. And I'm just going to add, now I need a wage accrual and a tax accrual. And let's pretend we don't need locations for a second. If all we needed was this one company splitting it out by department, we're now done and we can do our PTO journal and then our wage and tax journal, and we're done for the month. So, however, I'm going to then change this a little bit. Let's say, for example, because we were talking at the beginning about how this can be easy to update month to month. Let's say that I'm working with a company that has more employees. So let's say that the month following this, our company hired 3 employees. We're going to run into an issue because when I copy the data, now this individual doesn't have any formulas, so I'd have to copy that down. But also, our pivot table isn't going to include them because we specified that we only wanted to go down to row 31. So what I would recommend is whenever you're doing a pivot table, rather than specify a range of rows because the number of rows can change, I would highlight the entire column or columns, and that's going to create this little section here for blank cells, but it will ensure that you're not just entirely omitting employees at the bottom here. The other thing you can do is to copy all of these formulas, scroll down a bit, and paste them. That way, you know, and in this example, down to 130, or doesn't really hurt to even, if we just skip down a bunch, let's say that we're pretty sure that it's going to be a while before we have 400 employees. You can just take those calculation columns and copy them down, and that way we could even just do all of our employees across all of our various companies. And let's say that we had a big hiring spree, or we're doing this for more than one company at a time. And now we can paste that data, and we already have our formulas going down. Then when we go to our pivot table, if we click on the refresh button, now it's including all of our companies. So, and that's essentially also how we're going to update this month to month. I don't have a second set of data prepared, but for the sake of argument, what we would do is we'd reach out to our 3 sources, run the reports, delete everything that's here, although leaving our calculation of our hourly rate, and then just paste the new data into these same columns. And then for the combined data, we'll have to go to our master source and basically just copy over all the employees. And then if we go to the pivot table, we can refresh. And the whole process, once you've run your 3 reports out of your payroll or HR system, should be a matter of 5 to 10 minutes to get to your calculation. Now, the next step of this is I'm going to assume that it's possible that the person that's doing this calculation is not doing the journal entry, or that you want to have some sort of backup for your journal, but you don't want to have, for example, everyone's pay rate in the company in that location where a lot of people can access it. So the way that we can fix this is I'm going to right click on the worksheet, and I'm going to move it. I'm going to create a copy, and I'm just going to move to a new workbook. And at the moment, if I wanted to drill down on something, let's say I want to drill down on everyone that's in this operations in company 3, I can pull the information and I can still get to the data because that data has been saved with the pivot table. So to stop that, we're going to right click anywhere in the pivot table and go to the pivot table options. And on the data tab, we're going to uncheck save source data with the file and enable show details. And what that's going to do is if someone tries to drill down on any of these numbers, they won't be able to, but this is still in a format where when we need to post our accrual journals, we still have it broken out by company, by department. If I had left location, we'd also have that. And then this can be distributed, or this can be saved elsewhere, and there isn't anything that someone can take and come back to the data of knowing which specific employees have which balance or what their hourly rates are. So the last bit that I would like to cover is just a quick comment on error checking. Like I said before, I'm not looking to do a ton of error checking. The ones that I would do, however, are we can do some checks to confirm that there aren't like duplicate employees. Because let's say, for example, that you run this report with PTO balance and one employee shows up twice. The way that I would fix this, or that I would check for this, is from the home page, you can do some conditional formatting. And basically, you want to highlight the cell if there's duplicate values. And I'll just leave it at their default. So, for example, let's just say this person came through as employee 9. It's going to be pretty obvious when you get your data. Because you've applied that to the entire column, when you delete the data and paste the new data in, it should keep that conditional formatting rule and then show up as an error. And if your data set is too large for you to scroll through to see if there's anything red, we can filter. And then you don't need to filter by a value, you can filter by a color. So we can just say, show me everything that's red. Let me switch this back. Another error we might have is, let's say that one of our employees just isn't there. So let's say that our first employee just isn't in our data of our pay rate. So when we come back here, we're going to get some error values. And then if I refresh the pivot table is also going to have error values. So if that happens and it's just one employee, so if you come to your combined data, filter it and sort by the errors, and it's just one employee, could be an issue of the timing of when the report was run. It could be that for some reason that person hasn't been input yet. If it's just one employee, I usually go in and manually add them the first month and then just make sure that they do populate the following month. If, however, you do have multiple employees that aren't showing up in your data, you might then have just a data integrity error. You might be running the wrong filters, whatever that is. But for these kinds of reports where normally the current employees, or just running a report saying give me a pay rate for all employees, usually includes everyone, I'm going to stop with that as my error checking, either for duplicate values using the conditional formatting, or just kind of a quick manual check to confirm that there aren't any non-applicable errors. The only other thing that I would do on a monthly basis is to go to my combined data worksheet and skip to the bottom just to confirm that all of these formulas are calculating there. Easiest way to do that is to click somewhere in our raw data here and just hit Control down. And we can see here that our data is down to this row and the formulas have gone far enough. If, for example, let's say that the data had stopped here, then we would know that we need to drag it more. Like I said, I would just take this a couple hundred rows beneath where you think you need it, and then you should be good to go. One last item that I'll mention before I wrap up this video is this is a cumulative calculation. So the easiest way to implement this your company is to set up all of these journals as reversing. So this, for example, might be the accrual for January. Then when we get to February, we'll reverse the January and reaccrue the new number for February. It does create a bit of noise in the accounting system, but it's much cleaner than trying to keep track of a calculation for January, a calculation for February, and then only posting a journal that changes that balance. That gets to be a much messier situation. It's much cleaner just to post the January accrual, and then when you start February, eliminate it down to so your PTO, wage, and tax accruals are all going to be at 0. Then when you calculate a cumulative number for February, we'll post the February, and we know that the only thing that should be in that account is the journal that we just posted. So I hope this all helped and you're able to go out and retrieve your data, set up a template, and improve one of your month-end processes to be more efficient. So good luck in Excel, and I'll see you on the next video.